Well, both the events in Israel between the Israelis and the Palestinians, and of course the terrorism in Indonesia, has elements of religion, and there are once again raises questions of extremism, what draws people toward extremism, and the role of religion in conflict. Professor Richard Dawkins is an evolutionary biologist, author and well-known atheist. He's in Australia to do a series of talks over the coming days in Sydney, Melbourne and Brisbane, which is where he joins me from now. Nice to have you on the program, Professor. Thank you for joining us.
Good evening.
I want to turn your mind to the events both in Israel and, of course, what we've seen in Indonesia. And no doubt you've been thinking about this and you've spoken about these issues in the past. But speak to us again about that connection that you see. Where does religion intersect with the violence that we are seeing right now?
I think that religious faith, because it is belief in something without evidence, does promote violence. Because if you have been brought up from childhood, and many of these people have, sent to madrasas from childhood, they've been taught that Islam is the one true faith. They've been taught to believe in the Quran literally, and they really do believe that. They believe absolutely in the rightness of their religion. They don't have to defend it because it is faith. And the really pernicious thing about faith is precisely that it doesn't have to justify itself. It simply says, that is my faith, that's what I believe, and you can't argue with that. I think that is very pernicious.
You've mentioned Islam specifically, and I know you've made this point in the past that you believe it is more prone to that, while also pointing out that most Muslims are peaceful. But do you not see elements of this in other religion as well? We're seeing the crackdown on the Rohingya right now in the mainly Buddhist Myanmar. We've seen a history of violence in Christianity, the 30 Years' War, the Crusades, and of course we've seen violence between Jews and Palestinians just in the past day as well. Do you see it as more broadly a religious question and not just an Islamic question?
I certainly do, yes. I mean, everything that you've just said plays right into my hands about religious faith. Any faith is potentially going to have the same bad effects. It so happens that just at present Islam is the main culprit, but as you've rightly said, in historical times the behaviour of Christianity has been utterly appalling, and for exactly the same reason.
Let me make the counter-argument. Karen Armstrong, of course, who you would know well, has written a lot about religion and wrote a book about religion and violence, and she says it's too easy, in a sense, to say this is based on faith or religion, but it's the intersection of faith and religion with politics or nationalism or historical grievance, that it's not the religion itself, but the intersection of religion with these other issues.
I think any kind of identity politics can have that effect, and nationalism, say in the First World War, it was nationalism that primarily drove it. But religion is extremely powerful in doing this because children are educated in religion, indoctrinated in religion from a very, very young age, and they have this fanatical loyalty which is instilled into them in early childhood. And Islam really is a particular culprit in this regard today. Other religions have been very bad in the past.
I suppose, though, that the question here is it the religion or the faith that is motivating the violence, or the politics that co-opts the religion to carry out the violence? We know that a lot of people, for instance, who are recruited to join groups like Islamic State or Al-Qaeda, some of those involved in the 9/11 bombings, for instance, were not necessarily religious figures or religious people, but had come to that religion, potentially from a political motivation.
Political motivation is often important. It was, for example, in Northern Ireland, which is another place where we have religious violence. But the role of religion is to identify which party you belong to, which group you belong to. There's a lot of in-group, out-group hostility, and that and politics and economics indeed becomes important there. You have groups which are oppressed, as the Palestinians undoubtedly are. But religion is the identifying factor that enables them to know, enables everybody in the conflict to know which side they're on, and it foments immense hostility against the other side.
Now, is there not a paradox here as well, that those like you who have argued against religion and have argued for rationality, for science, for liberalism, for instance, there's also been critics who've said that a hyper-liberalism has extracted the meaning from life. You mentioned the economy and the market, but the substitution of the economy and the free market for society and community is often driving people to religion or extremism to find some sense of belonging. Do you see that paradox between a hyper-liberalism on the one hand and driving people to faith on the other?
That had not occurred to me. I'm not quite sure that I understand what you're saying there. Are you saying that liberal politics can kind of come as a substitute for religion?
What I'm saying is that John Gray's made this point, the British philosopher, is that hyper-liberalism can hollow out life. And so some people may find a meaning in an extremism. In fact, it may feed people to find some meaning in a religious extremism that they may not otherwise have sought out.
I would have a hard time sympathising with that. I would have a hard time sympathising with anybody who said that their life has become meaningless because of liberalism, and therefore they turn to violent religion. I think that's not a position that I would have any sympathy with.
Your atheism has been criticised as being condescending or bullying, if you like. Some have even said that it becomes a religion unto itself. How do you respond to that?
Well, it's very different from a religion. I write books. People can read them if they want to. I don't force them on people. There's no indoctrination of children, which is the thing I've had a particular bee in my bonnet about in atheism. I have a scientific, rational point of view. There's nothing fundamentalist about it. I'm not saying I have a holy book and my holy book says this, therefore it's right. I'm saying this is the evidence. Look at the evidence. Look at the evidence for yourself and come to your own conclusion. If you do that, then you will come to your own conclusion if you look at the evidence in a dispassionate, rational way.
Does atheism or a loss of faith or a turning away from faith, does that fill the void that people seem to need, though, to have a sense of belonging or have a sense of a belief in something greater than themselves and their own capacity?
Well, I don't think that there's much evidence that people need that. I mean, the number of people going to church nowadays in Christendom is going down all the time. People don't seem to miss that. I don't think we have any particular void that needs to be filled. If we did, then there's plenty of things that could fill it. I mean, there's science, there's art, there's music, there's poetry, there's getting together, listening to lectures, there's human warmth, human love, indeed sex.
But even those who don't necessarily go to church on a regular basis and may have a more relaxed attitude to faith, they'll still carry out christenings, they will still have funerals in the church, weddings in the church, observe Easter, observe Christmas. Is this not important as part of the glue of our society and sense of belonging and community?
It's possible that we need rituals for coming of age, for weddings, for funerals and that kind of thing. And religion does that as well as anything. Well, not quite as well as anything. I actually find secular funerals rather more moving than religious funerals, but they do weddings quite decently. I don't think that's a very important consideration. I mean, we can do ritual without religion if we want to.
I want to turn your mind to something that we've seen in recent times, and that is this turning away from faith in institutions, as we're talking about faith more broadly, faith in science, faith in our academic institutions, faith in our political institutions, faith in our legal institutions. We see this in surveys that show there is an erosion of that trust. What do you put that down to?
I don't know. I'm rather distressed by that. I mean, how you can lose faith in science when science is the objective study of facts, of the actual factual basis of the universe in which we live. I mean, it is. There's nothing else. There's no other way of knowing what is true other than the scientific method. So I just don't get that.
But it seems to be tied very much to our politics right now, doesn't it? I mean, an issue like climate change, for instance, ceases to be a debate necessarily about the facts of science, becomes very ideological. And that's just one example of the sort of politics that we're seeing now, which is tapping into this turning away from institutions.
Well, that is true, and I mean, climate change is a scientific matter, and science is the the field which should be in which we should study climate change, ideological considerations are not relevant, and nor are economic considerations. Science is where it's at there.
What are the risks in what we're seeing here more broadly for democracy? We know that in parallel with declining faith in our institutions has been an erosion of democracy as well. You have someone like Viktor Orban in Hungary talking about an illiberal democracy. Donald Trump, you have the Brexit vote, examples that some have pointed to of people who may be still going through a democratic process, but a swing away from some of the core values of democracy. Do you see that?
Yes, I do, and I fear it. I think it's a very unpleasant trend. I think that Donald Trump, well, we saw it in the case of moving the American embassy to Jerusalem. I think a lot of what he does, he has form in this, is actually sort of giving the finger to liberals. He's actually doing it, but as a way of cocking a snook at people that he doesn't like, and that's true of many of his supporters. I think many of his supporters voted for him out of reasons of prejudice.
And yet people are still seeking something, aren't they? They are seeking to vote for Brexit. They are seeking to vote for Donald Trump. Increasing numbers for someone like Viktor Orban in the recent election.
Yes, I fear that's true, but we'll see what happens in subsequent elections.
Are you just quickly someone who has an optimistic or pessimistic view when you see the future of something like democracy in our world right now?
I have a somewhat pessimistic view. I think that in the case of Brexit, we saw, as it were, in a way, the wrong kind of democracy. I think that it was an exceedingly complicated issue, which was not one that should be decided by plebiscite. If ever an issue should not have been given to the British people, it's that one, because that's a highly complicated economic matter. And
a complicated world, but nice to be able to pick your brain this evening on the program. Professor, it's good to have you on. Thank you.
Thank you very much.